To begin with constructing this framework, I shall work my way backwards in order to go about this construction that quote-unquote I am attempting. We begin with a fundamental point. Existence fundamentally it is merely the state of being, as opposed to non-existence, which is merely the lack of being. Thus, the question of what is the meaning of existence may just be pointless, for it amounts to questioning what is already established as a given reality. In other words, what the question should really be is as follows: how do we understand, or how should we seek to understand reality as it is, in all its complexity and mystery? Hence, we ought to understand how it is, in all its complexity and mystery, regardless of what theoretical boxes we may try to put it in. This is where the differing possible frameworks that we can employ comes into play here, to facilitate our understanding of these differing dimensions or aspects of reality, precisely as it is and exists. These different frameworks explain different aspects of reality, and are not conflicting frameworks regarding reality itself. For example, see my previous work, available as article and video, Dissolving the Conflict Between the Spiritual and Material. Oftentimes we come to realize that these frameworks aren't even in conflict in the first place to begin with, even if the historical manifestations were so. When we reach beneath the superficial surface of many of these conflicts, we quickly realize that these various frameworks all have important insights that can be incorporated into one's worldview. Oftentimes, we come to realize that these fundamental frameworks, or paradigms, aren't even in conflict in the first place in reality, to begin with, even if their historical manifestations were at one point or another. When we reach beneath the superficial surface of many of these supposed conflicts, we quickly realize that these various frameworks all have important insights that can be incorporated into one's worldview. Thus, one can incorporate, in fact, differing elements of these differing worldviews into one's own, such as the religious and scientific outlooks. In reality, these two aren't even necessarily in conflict in the first place, even if their respective historical manifestations at times have been, for they fundamentally deal with differing aspects of reality. We can also incorporate differing elements of the pre-modern, modern and postmodern worldviews, and of other supposed dialectics such as that of progress and reaction, etc., etc. Like I have mentioned in my past video, in fact in my latest video, in reality, the dialectic of progress and reaction really breaks down under further scrutiny. Because in truth, they are very much relative and subjective terms, and in truth, one does not necessarily have to oppose change or accept change for its own sake. One must look at the change itself, look at its merits, look at the development itself, look at its strengths and weaknesses, and come to a conclusion based on the merits of the thing itself, and not merely be reactionary against it or progressive with it. Let us further expound upon the supposed dialectic between the forces of progress and reaction as an example here. We can use the ideas of development instead of progress, which is not inherently good or bad, but can be either, or indeed both, or perhaps proportionally doing just as much good and evil at the same time, or doing good and evil in differing ways or aspects. Each development, like I have mentioned, should be judged on the basis of their own merits. Thus, this may help us to break out of the simplistic reaction versus progress binary. We can further appreciate that there is a gradual development and realization of man, in his self and attributes manifested through his acts. This can be in differing faculties, whether it be humanity's knowledge, or the evolution of the individual and collective conscience of humanity. For more on this topic, see my previous work, Mankind, Past and Trajectory. This is a lesson to be taken for the profound symbolism of the teaching that man is created in the image of God, or even inversely, that our conceptions of the divine are created in man's image, if one was to take that line of reasoning. The benefit to be taken here, regardless of one's viewpoint, is that it represents a standard of perfection, which man may be able to, partially and in an incomplete and fallible manner, imitate and replicate, by which he manifests fully his role as divine vicegerent on earth via being a locus of these divine attributes, a limited, fallible reflection in a constant state of completion but never fully completed. For example, when it comes to the knowledge of man, there is always some unknown, some new thing to be discovered. In terms of the divine image, God's knowledge is understood as perfect and complete, essentially a standard of perfection which humanity should strive to imitate, albeit imperfectly, as humans are bound to be by their very nature. Man's self exists alongside his attributes. The self acts as the locus of these attributes, manifested through his acts. In other words, man is in a constant state of longing and striving, constantly striving in the perfection and completion of itself in spirit via his attributes manifested through his acts. In other words, it is in reflection of the divine, or this standard of perfection, that you may symbolically understand it as. As that famous quote from Hamlet goes, "What a piece of work is a man! How noble in reason, how infinite in faculties, in form and moving how express and admirable, in action how like an angel, in apprehension how like a god, the beauty of the word, the paragon of animals, and yet to me, what is this quintessence of dust?" This framework may have a few important implications. For example, take the idea that human knowledge is in a constant state of development and completion, but never fully complete. Human knowledge is akin to a project, constantly developing and evolving. In other words, we are constantly building upon the knowledge of our ancestors in all possible areas of study and walks of life. This is thus an issue that many of those who are committed to certain quote-unquote traditionalist ideals may fall into, insofar as they view the tradition as complete, or indeed, in other words, the final say, quote-unquote, in any matter. That mentality can actually be quite damaging in understanding the true nature of what tradition actually embodies. The full meanings and realities of certain teachings may be realized over time with the continuous development and expansion of knowledge. Whilst stemming from the past or the remnants of the old, we must continue to construct into the future. We build upon the heritage of our ancestors, and we will continue to do so. In fact, it may be better to view traditions as constantly developing, constantly evolving things, shaped by all those who have participated in them, for the greatest to the smallest of contributions. In fact, virtually all of human history and development, intellectual otherwise, has been in some sense, or in one way or another, organic developments. Organic developments which have developed in reaction to or in accordance with one thing or another, one stimulus or another. The developments may be the source of continuity or change, conflict or resolution, variation or divergence, etc., etc. A question may arise regarding the certainty that man can have in this knowledge of his. In truth, we cannot be absolutely certain due to the limits on our human faculties, which are limited and fallible, and in all honesty, that is okay. Thus, we see a kind of paradoxical, ironic, contradictory nature to humanity's existence in general, not just in his acquisition of knowledge. This is what I would term the divine mystery or divine paradox of humanity's existence, that element of humanity's existence which cannot be fully known, or perhaps isn't fully comprehensible or cannot be fully understood. This can further be supported by a verse of the Quran in chapter 2 verse 30, when the Lord God said to the angels, "Indeed, I will make upon the earth a successive authority, a caliph," in reference to the creation of man, the creation of Adam. They, the angels, said, "Will you place upon it one who causes corruption therein and sheds blood, while we declare your praise and sanctify you?" Allah, God, said, "Indeed, I know that which you do not know." In other words, the angels were startled at the creation of man, a being who is capable of much evil. However, the response of God may retain that kind of vagueness and mystery, but insofar as it applies to humanity's existence. But in reality, humanity is simultaneously capable of much good and of much evil. And so what differentiates man from merely being an evil thing or from merely being a good thing? Well, part of that is man's free will and free agency in the world. Either he can choose to be good or choose to be evil. But furthermore, it is the gradual self-realization of man that allows him to fully understand his self slowly but surely. It is understood that man has this natural creative and curious impulse to understand the world, to seek to understand it, to seek to understand its full reality. And so, whilst man's place in the cosmos may be shrouded in mystery, it is important to note that humanity simultaneously is quite a paradoxical figure within which this kind of paradoxical characteristics are embodied in. He is thus simultaneously capable of much good and of much evil. He is simultaneously capable of tapping into the lower self, but also into the higher self. On another note, this also implies that the full reality of an event may not be fully intelligible in that moment, yet it may be with the benefit of hindsight, or it may never be so. We may never grasp or understand the full reality of it, but perhaps we can at least seek to understand part of that reality, or at least gain an approximation of it. In fact, we further understand this from the creation of Adam, whereby he taught man the names of all things, proof of the fact that the distinguishing virtue of man from other animals is knowledge and cognizance, as understood by some such as Ghazali, which the angels were unable to name. Later on, the fall from heaven led to humanity arriving on earth, and thus began the story of humanity, one of much tragedy and hope, of good and evil, a human or to human story. For those who perhaps do not want to understand this literally, or those who are more agnostic-minded or perhaps do not subscribe to the mythologies of organized religion, you can still benefit from this narrative by understanding it symbolically and metaphorically and appreciating the symbolic meanings that these stories provide regarding human nature and the human condition, and the insights which they provide regarding them. There is a quite powerful verse of the Quran which further reinforces this sentiment in chapter 2 verse 38. We said, "Descend, all of you," in referring to the descent of Adam from heaven to the earth. Then when guidance comes to you from me, whoever follows it, there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. The deeper fundamental emotional sentiment here for man's existence in this state is of a dual nature. There is the sentiment of both tragedy and hope, of longing, of belonging and feeling lost. And it is that dual nature which gives man this quite paradoxical condition that it experiences and embodies. In man's constant quest for knowledge and understanding, we may not gain the whole or absolute truth due to our limitations as human beings, but perhaps we can gain approximations to it, and this further reinforces that paradoxical nature of man in relation specifically to his knowledge and understanding of the world. One of the great Quranic insights thus is to shed light on this almost paradoxical, contradictory nature of man, to shed light on this kind of dual nature that man has. In another sense, or in another vein, we can use differing philosophical frameworks or methods of understanding in order to attempt to understand differing aspects or dimensions of human existence and of reality more broadly. For example, at the time of writing the article upon which this video is inspired, I was reading some of Albert Camus's essays, particularly his The Myth of Sisyphus. I would partially borrow from the kind of absurdist perspective that Camus presents. there is indeed that kind of element of absurdity and irony even to human existence. And so seeking to understand it in mere non-absurd or, even more broadly, merely seeking to understand it in these purely rational terms itself might be, quite ironically, quote unquote, an absurd endeavor. In other words, any attempt to grasp some kind of meaning to one's life would do well to acknowledge, at least partially, this absurd nature to human existence itself, and not merely describe or try to put the whole of the human condition in these neat boxes. However, this is but one of the many aspects or dimensions of reality, which inherently may seem to have many supposedly contradictory aspects to it. In reality, they may not be contradictory, but not necessarily immediately intelligible to man. This highlights the need for a broader metaphysical, philosophical, and spiritual framework. As per the rules of classical logic, such contradictory aspects, in truth, aren't really contradictory or aren't truly so. For example, there are certain rules to establish the existence of a contradiction, such as being in the same time, same place, etc., such that the existence of one negates the existence of the other. In another vein, we can, at least partially, co-opt some postmodernist ideas, or we can partially co-opt some of the thought of, for example, Nietzsche. We can borrow from, like I mentioned, Nietzsche, but also other postmodernists like Leon, Lyotard, Foucault, Butler, etc., etc., in the face of the destruction of the old meta-narratives. Facing the destruction, or at least the decline in trust and skepticism towards of these grand meta-narratives, whether it be those of modernity or of pre-modernity, we may be forced to construct, or rather, like I would term it, reconstruct our values anew. However, insofar as individuals form greater collective wholes on an organic level, this necessitates the reconstruction of traditions anew, as there is no meaning for societies to exist without these quote-unquote discourses. Thus, we can in fact attempt to co-opt these different philosophical frameworks, or at least some of their ideas, and apply some of them in the different aspects of reality we seek to understand, whether it be some of the absurdist ideas, or some of the ideas of the postmodernists, or indeed some of the ideas of the various modernist schools of thought, etc., etc. In truth as well, a fundamental characteristic of traditions is that they are constantly evolving, constantly developing entities, shaped by all those who have participated and helped to develop them. A mistake that many traditionalists may make is to view these as ends in and of themselves, to be replicated and maintained for their own sake, which oftentimes leads to a dogmatic, rigid, doctrinaire approach. In truth, one shouldn't seek to reproduce hierarchy for its own sake, but rather, one should actively participate in the construction of dynamic, developing, living traditions that are constantly evolving. And in truth, many of those who have this more, let's just say, doctrinaire approach to traditions inevitably end up going against the spirit of the tradition. They go against the dynamic spirit, or even revolutionary spirit at times, which made those traditions possible in the first place, which made the development of those traditions possible in the first place, because it ignores the fact that these traditions have developed on a historical level. Furthermore, we can extend this logic, at least partially, to revolution, which shouldn't be for its own sake, but rather should be on the basis of these kinds of organic developments, based on these organic changes. One must be able to construct viable alternatives and not succumb to tyranny or despotism, as unfortunately many revolutions have succumbed to. And this actually brings me on to something else, which is that many people, especially from a more spiritual angle, will view these traditions as seeking something higher, seeking something more transcendental, seeking higher truth and higher meaning. And this is the fundamental spirit of many traditions. And people who are overly focused or overly dogmatic regarding the exoteric, the outward, superficial aspects of these traditions tend to ignore or overlook or downplay the esoteric aspects. In reality, they end up in many cases going against the spirit of what these traditions ought to be. Man understands from reflection on this temporal realm that things are constantly coming in and out of existence. In other words, this existence is contingent, going through a constant state of change. These things do not exist by creating themselves, nor do they simply appear into existence from nothingness. There can thus be understood from logical reasoning the existence of a necessary being, who himself is not created, from whom all of existence stems. It cannot be a contingent entity, for this would merely necessitate infinite regress, which is a logical impossibility. Thus, this necessary being would embody such attributes that would constitute this divine entity being a necessary being. In other words, they would have the attributes of said necessary being, without which they would cease to be this necessary being. That, of course, is the theological perspective that many theologians may give. However, touching upon a more spiritual conception of the divine, there is this popular concept, particularly in Sufi Islam, of wahdatul wujud, oneness of existence. What this may be properly understood as, in an Islamic context which rejects pantheism on a fundamental level, is that the divine is the real existent. The real existence from whom all other existence stems, and there is no meaning for their existence except by his willing of it to be. In other words, it is accepting that all of existence stems from the one true being, and there is no meaning for their existence besides stemming from that existence. You can also understand this as the divine being the real existent, because all other existence depends upon it for its existence. If it wasn't for its willing to be so, then it would not exist at all. This is further emphasized in the Quran that kullu man alayha fan, that all on it or all in the creation is constantly in a state of perishing. If it wasn't for the will of the divine, then all of these things would cease to exist merely in the blink of an eye. This mystical or more spiritual understanding of the oneness of existence can also be seen reflected in various other teachings, in various mystical strands of, for example, the various Hindu denominations. You can see similar understandings as well within faiths like Christianity. You can also see this within various other Eastern and esoteric traditions. In other words, it's describing that oneness of being with the divine. It's describing the divine presence that man can feel and even experiences at times. And this is what many spiritualists may understand to be the goal of traditions. By seeking these higher truths, by seeking these higher aims, one can experience the presence of the divine and seek the divine, the ultimate truth principle, so to speak. Again, for those of you who are more secular, or those of you who maybe don't subscribe to a religious or spiritual understanding, you can understand this fundamentally as a kind of oneness of being, perhaps with the universe, with existence itself, where the being is folded and subsumed into the broader tapestry of existence itself. But furthermore, it's also symbolic of seeking the highest truths of existence and seeking to understand the highest truths of reality itself. But furthermore, you can understand that this divine being is thus one which is simultaneously immanent and transcendental, one which is closer to his servants than its jugular vein, and one whom there is nothing like whatsoever. In very much all of the various traditions of the world, we see this theme reflected of seeking these higher truths, seeking these higher meanings, this higher understanding of reality, and seeking to understand this divine essence, and the truth of reality itself. And like I said, symbolically, if you don't want to understand it as such, you can rather understand it as reality in and of itself as it is. You can understand it symbolically as seeking to understand reality as it is, as one's being understanding reality so well that it is subsumed into the fabric, the tapestry of existence itself. And hence it is seeking that higher truth, that higher purpose, by which man may gain salvation, so to speak. It is through the realization of these highest truths, the realization of understanding the most intricate and mysterious aspects of reality and coming to terms with existence itself as it is, that paves the path for the salvation of the human mind, of human understanding, and of the human soul, and of the spirit of man, which is constantly striving in search of what reality really is.